evening to listeners of DBS Radio, wherever you are, and viewers of DBS Facebook. We are live from the State House Conference Center, where tonight the very first stakeholders consultation of the electoral reform report. Tonight with me will be young Jamasha Mello. I just want to say good evening to you, Jamasha.
Good evening, Cecil. Bonjour, tout le monde qui a écouté. Bonsoir. Plutôt, bonsoir tout le monde qui a écouté Radio DBS. Et puis aujourd'hui, nous en place conférence State House là, quand il y a une première consultation à ce changement processus élection, et bien, quand il y a dit en anglais electoral reform. Aujourd'hui, il y a joué depuis avocat en State House là, place conférence State House là, pour une suggestion à ce changement processus élection.
Well, tonight, as you heard from Jamasha, that this is the stakeholders group meeting with the legal fraternity that will be chaired by Ambassador Francine Barron, the CEO of CREED, and there is an agenda where we'll be having a prayer and welcome remarks. Also, too, we need to inform people, Jamasha, that in reference to the Electoral Commission, that there are men and who are actually responsible for the whole Electoral Commission. Mm-hmm. And we have the chairman, who is Duncan Stowe. We have Lennox Lawrence, Wayne James, Alec Lawrence, Hilary Shillingford, and the chief election officer is Mr. Ian Michael Anthony.
Yes. Content nous avons plusieurs monde qui a parlé à ce changement processus élection, chef pour electoral commission, nous chef pour élection, même chef officier pour élection. Et puis aujourd'hui, il y a un monde qui met conférence là, ça c'est ambassadeur Francine Barron, il c'est chef officier exécutif pour CREED, et puis qui a parlé. Nous ni en l'autre bitin qu'a fait, en prière, nous avons dit tout le monde bienvenue. Après ça, nous avons monsieur Levi Peter, avocat général pour le gouvernement Dominique, quand il a parlé à ses comptes, report ça là. Et puis après ça, nous avons tous ces avocats là qui sont ici. Et d'autres monde ici aussi, pas moun hot Dominique tout seul, mais moun hot OAS, OECS, pays CARICOM, et puis nous avons moun hot Commonwealth aussi. Puis monsieur Skerrit, premier ministre avec le gouvernement, qui est tous ces gens là pour aider pour process là marcher doucement, et pour process là fait avec toute règle qui est possible.
Well, as you heard, that there are also representatives from other parts of the region. We have CARICOM and also representative from the OAS, the Commonwealth, and that of the OECS. And as you heard in reference to the schedule for tonight, we have an overview of the electoral reform report and a summary of the recommendation by the Honorable Attorney General Levi Peter, and then we have an open forum. We have a number of lawyers who are present here this evening that will be making their contribution on the electoral reform report.
À part de ça, tout le monde parlement ici aussi, nous avons le gouvernement Dominique, différents ministères, différents représentatifs pour différentes communautés. Ici, nous avons recommandations, suggestions qui sont sorties de l'avocat. Ça c'est la première consultation de plusieurs qui sont venus. Il a été à 6-28, mon frère, 8 à où, il a été sur ça. C'est la première. De plaisir, et bien nous ça expecté bon bitin. Nous ça c'est le premier monde qui a joué une loi. Et bien moi quoi yo mérité ça, yo mérité pour ni suggestion yo à si changement processus élection puis ça affecté nous tout ça Dominique.
Well, it's important that as you rightly said in reference to the attorneys of our beautiful country Dominica, the Commonwealth of Dominica, where these attorneys will be sitting and having dialogue with the necessary stakeholders to ensure that what's within the report of Mr. Byron in reference to the recommendations that you would have made to central government. We know that two reports were given, one on the registration of Electors Act and the other and also an extension of the registration of Electors Regulation of 2023. Also in phase 2 of his report, he had the electoral reform of the Commonwealth of Dominica. And tonight, all of this will be discussed by the various attorneys from the various parts. And sure, the public out there are all excited and wanting to hear what the attorneys have to say in reference to the reform.
Yes. Ewe kontan sa fwet de faz, yon a si registration il moun ki ka vote a Dominic, ewe yon a si wanjman proses la même, ewe nou kay tan hoti avoka la, ewe kon nou di aussi se moun sa la ke ni opinion yo ke ni tan la pou ba opinion yo, ewe yo kay pon tout suggestion asi sa. Pou jodi a, nou ke tan hod plizye moun, mon ka wè plizye di yo ja asis deja. Moi madame magistrat Kanye Carrot George moi d'autres avocats aussi nous quand qui bite que roule bien yo tenir assez temps pour vous savez garder ces deux livres ça là puis ces livres vous ça taper document là c'est ligne aussi mais yo tenir temps pour garder ces livres ça là avec document ça là et puis garder comment il a affecté yo comme avocat comment il a affecté peuple Dominique nous ka parler contre loi avec différentes registrations avec guide loi Dominique moi quoi c'est vraiment bitin qui c'est un bon bitin pour nous à Dominique nous à SP suggestion premier pas à suggestion pour
Well, we know that the discussion of electoral reform started way back in 2004 when the Honorable Prime Minister himself, when he became Prime Minister, indicated that he too had an interest in the electoral reform. And 2009, we saw the opposition themselves making claim for the electoral reform. And the Prime Minister this week, last weekend, we heard him make mention of the fact that yes, he is in agreement to electoral reform. Whatever the people of the Commonwealth of Dominica has decided, that he will ensure that he will go through the process of electoral reform.
Yes,
and in so doing, we have seen quite a number of people showing great interest in that discourse. And whether it's political or otherwise, the fact is people are discussing the issue of electoral reform. As we become in a modernized country, we have seen quite a lot of changes in Dominica, and so some of the things that we have to look at is sanitizing of the lease, and we have another campaign financing, IDs, all of these things are up for discussion, and we would have seen from Sir Byron's report as to exactly what is required for us to be doing.
Oui, c'est ça même. Content nous kay yo gouvernement ka mandé pour ça depuis l'année 2009 et vous savez yo mettez attention à ça mais c'est vraiment dit dans l'année 2020 les premiers jours à septembre 2020 yo tapé sur Byron et puis yo dit vous savez nous le report à ça on y fait une consultation et ben nous le report et ben monsieur Byron il fait report ça là il garder process élection Dominique et ben nous ouais qui en année 2019 les gouvernements teni élection yo teni moun en Dominique ka observer élection pour assurer tout bite ka marcher en règle nous tan yo reporter après élection fini avec yo dit oui c'est vrai bite ka marcher en règle à Dominique et même ça nous tan report monsieur Dennis Byron report là tout dit il y travail pour faire toujours mais l'élection à Dominique a fait avec règle ka suivre guide et c'est vraiment vous savez, mon n'est pas assise avec lui, report là. Nous passons à l'ISP pour tanner. Nous n'est pas assise avec lui, avec essayer de comprendre, mais pas l'ISP pour livre la vie devant avec un monde qui est libre. Puis, quand Dominique, tout bite c'est ça fait nous. Il peut affecter nous aussi, mais mon cas qui est assis, mon pour ça aller assis ligne. Garder pour report là. Avec bon temps, lui, si vous pas comprendre ou ça, écouter consultation, ok, parler contre avec expliquer plusieurs différentes manières pendant ces jours à passer.
And that is so important in what you have just said in Creole, that in reference to we as a people, the importance of reading, the importance of understanding what is before us. Too many times that we depend on quite a lot of people wanting to tell us what we should believe, rather than we trying to read and have a clearer understanding as to what we're reading and having an understanding as to what we do. And so the Byron report is available. And I'm sure that if you are to get to the office of the Prime Minister, that you will be able to get copies that are made available to the public, so that you too can read and have a great
digital age, so people can access these copies online. It's not just get the book and put it in your house like a directory, but you can get this online as well. There are links you can follow. If you just search electoral reform report on Google. You can simply get Dominica's report online.
What is so very important too is that even the Dominicans living in the diaspora, that the consultation will be for them.
Yes, they'll be engaged as well.
Yes. And that's of great importance that they too, whether or not they are here, that it is important to give them that opportunity to partake and to understand what the process is and to understand what is required of them who live in the diaspora, because we have been hearing quite a lot of diverse views of people who are living in the diaspora or people who are living overseas as to whether or not they should be part and parcel of the process of our elections. But we have seen that from the consultation that they too will be having the opportunity to be given the chance to talk and to dialogue, whether you are in North America, you're in China, you're in Asia, wherever you are in the Caribbean, that the opportunity is going to be given to you. And also to the young people.
Yes.
There will be a day where consultation with the young people will be on, and they too will be having that opportunity to discuss with the people who are actually doing the consultation to really help in the development of that process that we are now talking about, which is electoral reform.
Yes, and like I said earlier, this is everybody's business. The process itself, the regulation of the process, the election itself affects everybody in Dominica. Well, not even just everybody in Dominica, but every citizen of the Commonwealth of Dominica. It will affect us. So it is our duty to remain abreast, our duty to get the information and make our collective opinion on the information and our informed opinion on the information as well. So this is why these consultations are important, and they are doing their utmost to meet with all stakeholders. It's not just people in government, but they are meeting with the regular people as well, because you have to vote and it matters to as well. So they are meeting with the people in various sectors, as we have NGOs being met, other political parties, people of the media, and today it starts off with the lawyers, people in the legal fraternity, not necessarily lawyers only, but magistrates, judges, and other members of the legal fraternity. So this is definitely something that is long awaited by the Dominican public, and I think it's a step in the right direction. Doing a consultation is a step in the right direction, because we do live in a democratic environment. So it is something that, we want the opinions of all, and that is what democracy is about. Receiving the opinions of all people, taking them into consideration, and then forming other parts to put together all in efforts to benefit the people of Dominica, and not just oneself or one specific party, but everyone in Dominica will be benefiting from this process, yes, electoral reform process, and the consultation is quite fitting for opinions of others.
And it needs to be known that since independence, that's 1998, that's like going to be 45 years since you've been an independent state.
Yes, that's correct.
That the Commonwealth of Dominica is governed by the House of Assembly Election Act, Chapter 201, and the Registration of Electors Act, Chapter 203. And it's important that, an act of that magnitude, some 45 years, now getting to 45 years since independence, that it's okay now, knowing how we are now seeing the world is been moving. We are now talking about AI, which is artificial intelligence. We are talking about global changes. We are talking about things that are happening around the world in terms of the necessary changes in which we need movement for. That it is good that central government, has seen the need, and as I indicated since 2004, that the government of Dominica has invited election observers to participate in the Dominica's election. And that tells you that if way back in 2004, which is like some 19 years ago, that observers have been asked to be here to see what we are doing and to help us to understand it. The Byron report itself has indicated some of the changes that is required, and I'm sure based on what our people have decided that we will see the necessary changes.
That's correct. And we are just awaiting the commencement of this ceremony, this consultation, that is, on the electoral reform process in the Commonwealth of Dominica. And qu'on nous a dit, Jordia, c'est première consultation à si changement processus élection là yo kay discuter report là hot so Dennis Byron qui yo receive et puis moi qui passé et ben Jordi yo ka joindre puis avocat eve dot moun travail loi à Dominique nous ni moun hod OAS Commonwealth OECS eve plusieurs d'autres organisations qui a affecté un pays eve nous ni moun aussi mo ka we moun asi ling aussi qui fait power yo asi ça Premier ministre M. Roosevelt Skerrit ici différents ministères en gouvernement ici et d'autres représentatifs en gouvernement Dominique ici. Et bien nous on a espéré pour commencement session ça là et nous quand commencer comment Madame Baron lever à Shaylee.
Yes, we have Madam Baron, Lady Baron, Ambassador, and that of Mr. Levi Peter at the head table. And I think it's a good time that we can now go across to the head table, or to the podium where the chairperson, Ambassador Baron, will be doing the welcome remark.
Yes. So let's go over to the podium now with Ms. Francine Baron.
Honorable Roosevelt Skerrit, Prime Minister, Honorable Members of Cabinet, Honorable Levi Peter, Attorney General, Pastor Samuel Augustine, Justice Amrafael Misaga from Commonwealth Secretariat, Ms. Meline Glynn from the Organization of American States, Mr. Sas Gunraj from CARICOM, Mr. Dwight Lay from the OECS, Cabinet Secretary Ms. Karen Prevost, Permanent Secretaries, Mr. Duncan Stowe, Chairman of the Electoral Commission, Dr. Kenneth Daru, Special Envoy with responsibility for electoral modernization, Director Public Prosecution, Ms. Shoma Dalrymple, Chief Magistrate, Ms. Candia Carrick-George, Magistrates, Registrars, Attorneys at Law, members of the media, good evening. As we start these consultations, let us invite the Lord into our midst. I therefore call on Pastor Samuel Augustine to lead us in prayer. Pastor.
Good evening. Let's pray. Our Father and God, tonight we indeed give you thanks. We give you thanks, O God, that in everything we are choosing to put you first in this nation, and that gives us the great confidence that things will work out well for us in the end because you are the center of it all. We pray today, God, and just want to say thank you, O God, that even by this demonstration here tonight, that truly the democracy and transparency are still thriving components of our civilization. Lord, we give you thanks, much thanks, more so in light of the various diversions and cultural shifts that we are seeing across the world, where these qualities, which are absolutely essential, are being sidelined. We thank you that right here in Dominica, we continue to hold true, oh God, to these things. We pray, God, and we give you thanks, because these proceedings, oh God, they demonstrate very highly that we believe in democracy and that in the Commonwealth of Dominica, every voice matters. God, we give you thanks. We invite your Holy Spirit here tonight, God, and we pray that the Holy Spirit of God would take control, and that in the spirit of unity and love for country, let there be the cancellation of every form of divisiveness, every form of divisive rhetoric and political mischief. God, we ask for your intervention in this first gathering and every subsequent one. We ask for your intervention. Let us not fail, oh God, to honor our internal convictions to build a united nation. Father, we give you thanks one more time. We ask that these deliberations, oh God, as they ensue, that your heart, oh God, would be felt in every conversation. We pray that even as we continue to talk and dialogue, oh God, that there will be deep personal and internal engagement even before a sharing. We ask, oh God, that there will be great levels of respect for the sanctity of the various offices represented here and for each other. And God, at the end of all of this, we pray that our nation will become stronger and better because of it. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen, Pastor. Thank you very much. Please be seated. And our apologies for the late start. I wish to welcome as well the Mrs. Noelis Knight Didier, the President of the Dominica Bar Association. Good evening to you all, and thank you for responding to the call to participate and share your perspectives and opinion on the electoral modernization process. As you may be aware, in September 2020, Sir Dennis Byron, former President of the CCJ and former Chief Justice of the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court, was appointed by the government of Dominica as an independent third party to review Dominica's electoral process and advise on changes to improve and modernize it. The full terms of reference are found on pages 4 and 5 of Phase 1 of the report. The engagement of Sir Dennis was done by the government of Dominica. However, the management of his duties was done by the Electoral Commission. In undertaking his responsibilities, Sir Dennis would have held widespread consultations, possibly with many of you who are here today. He would have also received written submissions and conducted an online survey. The report of Sir Dennis was made available to the government of Dominica on the 12th of June 2023 and is in two parts, Phase 1 and Phase 2. The report contains draft bills and regulations to give effect to recommendations made in the report, and this report was formally presented by the government to several key stakeholders, including the Dominica Bar Association, at a function at the State House Conference Center, right here in this room, on the 21st of June 2023, and it has since been made widely available to all on the Government of Dominica website. The government also committed to hold a series of public consultations to receive feedback on the report and draft legislation. I want therefore to welcome you this evening to the first of those consultations, which begins with you, the legal fraternity. The Prime Minister would also have informed the public that he invited the Commonwealth Secretariat, the Organization of American States, CARICOM, and the OECS to attend these consultations and provide assistance. I wish therefore to extend a special welcome also to the representatives of those organizations, Honorable Mr. Justice Amrafael Masaga, Ms. Meline Green, Mr. Sas Gunraj, and Mr. Dwight Lee. This evening, the Honorable Attorney General Levi Peter will give you an overview of the report and recommendations. And thereafter, the floor will be open to receive your feedbacks, your comments, and suggestions. I therefore ask Attorney General Levi Peter to come forward to address you. AG.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Protocol having been established, I will plow on, having said good evening, one and all. As we're all aware, we're here to consider the report of Sir Dennis Byron, on his review and consideration of Dominica's electoral system and the recommendations that he has made for reform or modernization of that system. This presentation is intended to provide an overview of the recommendations made by Sir Dennis Byron in his report and accompanying draft legislation, and to highlight significant areas of proposed change. The presentation is also not intended to be a commentary on the report and accompanying draft legislation, nor is it intended to be a detailed exposition of the provisions of those documents or the expression of opinion, whether my own or that of the government. Sir Dennis described his report as being comprised of two phases, as you heard a moment ago. Phase 1 he described as focusing on cleansing the voters list with emphasis on voter identification and the voter registration system, and the second aspect as including a legislative framework comprised of two bills namely the Registration of Electors Act 2023, which I will refer to in this presentation as the new Registration of Electors Act, and the Registration of Electors Regulations 2023. In his opinion, these pieces of legislation are necessary to modernize the current electoral system and to bring it into conformity with international best practice. So Dennis described phase 2 of his report as addressing the electoral process, number 1, and that focuses primarily on access to the media and campaign financing. 2, the Electoral Commission, and that focuses on the composition of the commission as he proposes it should be, its financial autonomy, its staffing, appointment of committees, the process for resignation from that commission, and its protection, or the protection of its members from suit. And the third aspect is new legislation, which Sir Dennis, accompanying his report, has provided 4 pieces of legislation that he proposes should be enacted. 1, the House of Assembly Elections Act of 2023. 2, the House of Assembly Regulations 2023. 3, the House of Assembly Elections Petitions Rules 2023, and the Electoral Commission Bill of 2023. So that is the preamble, if it were, as it were, to the presentation. Looking at phase 1 of the report and the draft Registration of Electors Act, which is the principal component, I suggest, of the legislative framework that Sir Dennis proposes should be put in place, and it reflects the recommendations that Sir Dennis has made. And those recommendations, as indicated, are intended to address the cleansing of the list or the register, the introduction of identification cards and other forms of voter identification, and thirdly, introduction of a voter registration system. The Registration of Electors Act, the new Registration of Electors Act, I should say, that which is proposed by Sir Dennis, is divided into 6 parts, which substantively align with the existing Registration of Electors Act and is intended to repeal and replace the existing Registration of Electors Act. The most significant parts of the Act, or the bill, as it now should be referred to, I suppose, is, certainly from a reform perspective, probably parts 3 and 5, which introduce new concepts and provisions intended to give effect to the recommendations made in the report in relation to the registration of electors. So part 3. Part 3 is comprised of clauses 6 to 34 and contain perhaps the most significant and substantive proposals as regards the amendments to the existing Registration of Electors Act. And it directly impacts the cleansing of the Register of Electors. The combined effect of the provisions of Part 3, which is found at Part 5, may be described, I suggest, as constituting a verification process. The provisions of Part 3 set out the requirements which must be satisfied in relation to the above identified issues in order for a person to be entitled to have his or her name entered and indeed remain in the Register of Electors. The report may be said to address each of these issues under the following heads. The first of those heads is residency. As you all know, there has been some discussion about the issue of residence and its relationship to voting in Dominica. Residency is, I suggest, the first element of the verification process, and for the purposes of elections in Dominica, may be said to have 2 distinct components. The first of these components relates to the entitlement to be registered to vote and is reflected in clause 7.1c of the new Registration of Electors Act. That is the bill that has been provided by Sir Dennis. This provision sets out the qualifying requirement namely that only if individuals who have been resident in the polling district for which they wish to be registered for at least 3 continuous months immediately preceding application for registration as an elector are able to have their names registered in the Register of Electors, or as we say colloquially, to get registered. Clause 71C largely mirrors Section 33(2)A of the Constitution of Dominica and Section 51D of the existing Registration of Electors Act. The registration, there are 2 aspects only in respect to the Registration of Electors Act and in respect to the issue of residency. There are only really 2 areas that are of difference to the existing position. And those are, 1, a provision that Sir Dennis recommends for 17-year-olds to be permitted to apply for registration. However, the recommendation is that they not actually be entered on the register until they attain the age of 18 years of age. And the second element that is new in the provisions as regards residence is a provision which would deem state employees who are stationed overseas, for example, people working in the diplomatic corps for Dominica, they would be able to have their residence deemed at a particular address, provided they had given that address to the chief registering officer prior to their departure. So in essence, it's a deeming provision, and it's to address that particular situation. So those are the 2 areas in which the residency element, as it relates to the basic registration requirements, are concerned. The other is what may be termed the absence from Dominica provision. Those who have been following over the discussions that have taken place over the years will be aware that the existing Registration of Electors Act at Section 7C provides as follows: a person registered pursuant to this part shall remain registered unless and until his name is deleted from the register because he has been absent from Dominica for a period exceeding 5 years. That has always been interpreted as, certainly almost universally, as providing that a person who is registered, if they go abroad, provided they come back at least once within a period of 5 years, and we're talking effectively of the 5 years preceding an election, that they would be entitled to vote. So Dennis's report proposes to change that. It proposes that that provision be abolished and replaced with the requirement that a person would be required to spend at least 90 days, or he puts forward an alternative, 50 days, within that same 5-year period. That is found at Clause 26(1) of the new Registration of Electors Act, which states as follows: a person whose name is in the Register of Electors and who lives outside Dominica shall not be regarded as having been absent from Dominica for the purposes of Section 12(b)(2), 13(4)(b), or 15(3)(b) if in the 5-year period immediately preceding the date of the last publication of the Register of Electors, the person visited and remained in Dominica for a period of at least 90/50 days, or for periods amounting in the aggregate to at least 90/50 days. Clause 26(1), as would be evident from what I've just read, will have, if it's enacted, a consequential impact on the new clause 12b(2), which would replace section 7 of the existing act by reducing the right of registered individuals to remain on the register. And secondly, it would impact new clauses 13(4)b and 15(3)b by increasing the number of people who would lose their right to remain registered and therefore would have their names removed from the register of electors. The second element of the verification process, I suggest, can be put under the heading of registration. Registration is addressed in the new draft Registration of Electors Act at clauses 7 and 9(1). Those two clauses are essentially the same as sections 5 and 8(1) of the existing Registration of Electors Act. And they do not alter the existing requirements in relation to registration significantly. The third element is identification cards. That, as we will all know, has been an issue. Sir Dennis's report proposes that identification cards are to be used at all elections as a mandatory requirement. That would be a change because, as it currently stands, the law provides at section 19 of the existing Registration of Electors Act that identification cards can be used. But it says that the Chief Registering Officer may use. So it's not obligatory. But it now would become, by way of clause 11 of the new Registration of Electors Act, it would become a mandatory requirement for identification cards to be used at all elections in Dominica. And clause 11, just for information, says, where a person has been duly registered as an elector, the Chief Registering Officer shall cause a national identification card in the prescribed form and containing the prescribed information to be issued to the person in accordance with the regulations. 2, the Chief Registering Officer may designate locations for the purpose of the issue of national identification cards. And 3, there shall be established and maintained by the Chief Registering Officer a roll of the names of persons to whom both national identification cards have been issued. There has been some dispute as to whether this ID card should be called a voter identification card or a national identification card, but there are also those who are of the view that this is a non-issue. For the purposes of the discussion, and certainly for the purpose of ensuring that a person who votes at an election is a person who is entitled to vote, the point that Sir Dennis is addressing is making the use of identification cards mandatory. The fourth element of the verification process that I identify is investigation. And that is the new, or the proposed new Registration of Electors Act would increase the authority of the Chief Registering Officer and the electoral officials to to request, seek, and secure information necessary to ensure that the list contains only the names of those people who are lawfully entitled to be on it. Clause 9 of the new Registration of Electors Act largely reflects Section 8 of the existing Act, except for 2 new provisions, which are as follows. Which give elections, one gives election officers greater discretion as to the nature of the information they are authorized to require from an occupier of a building, and that's at clause 9(4). And the other is that it creates a new offense of refusing to furnish information requested or providing false information to the Chief Registering Officer or electoral officials. And that is found at clause 9.5 of the new Registration of Electors Act. The second component of the new investigatory powers is at clause 10, and in clause 10 it is an entirely new provision that was not in the existing legislation, and it expressly empowers the Chief Registering Officer to carry out investigations for the purpose of verifying details provided to electoral officials and in electoral records, and to gather new information where necessary. The third element is, again, a new innovation proposed by Sir Dennis. That is at clause 27 of the new Registration of Electors Act, and it proposes the introduction of a provision that would oblige various public officials to provide to the Chief Registering Officer information within specified timelines. The requirements of clause 27 will include the following. The permanent secretary of the Ministry for Foreign Affairs must no later than the 30th of May every year submit to the Chief Registering Officer a report containing, as at the date of the report, the name of every person who is, 1, in service overseas, 2, a registered elector or eligible to be, and 3, who is no longer in service overseas. Another requirement, and there are several, but I only list 2, is that the chairman of the Mental Health Review Board will not later than the 15th day of the month following each quarter ensure that the following details are provided regarding each person who has been certified as having a mental disorder as defined under the Mental Health Act. And that information is to be provided to the Chief Registering Officer, namely the name, the street address, the date of birth, and the occupation of any person in that category, i.e. a person have been certified as having a mental disorder. The Mental Health Act defines mental disorder as mental illness or mental deficiency, however caused or manifested. And that is found in Section 2 of the Mental Health Act, which is in Chapter 4062 of the Laws of Dominica. That may be an interesting issue, but we will see as the consultation process unfolds. The fifth element of the verification process is another new feature. It is found at Part 5 of the new Registration of Electors Act, and within clauses 50 to 56, and it deals with confirmation of registration. This final element of the verification process sets out the process involved and what is required of those whose names are registered in the Register of Electors and are desirous of having their names remain in the register. This part authorizes the Electoral Commission to declare a period during which the confirmation shall take place. Secondly, to facilitate the confirmation of registration of persons who are overseas during the confirmation period. Thirdly, to ensure that adequate resources are made available to carry out the confirmation process in an efficient and timely manner. And fourthly, to prescribe regulations to give full effect to the provisions of the Registration of Electors Act relating to the confirmation of registration of electors. Any elector who fails to present his or herself for confirmation or presents his or herself but is unable to satisfy the Chief Registering Officer that he or she is entitled to be confirmed will have his or her name removed from the Register of Electors. That, in a nutshell, means that even if one is already on the Register of Electors, if at some point the electoral office, the Chief Registering Officer, declares a confirmation period, and the proposed legislation requires the Chief Registering Officer to do that within a short period after the Act would come into effect, then that would require everybody to basically re-register. It's a confirmation, so if you're already on the list, you would have to present yourself and conform with the requirements to have your name confirmed on the register so that you could remain. And if you fail to do so, your name would be removed. Part 4 is dealing with miscellaneous matters. Essentially, it provides for offenses and penalties, some which are new, that will attach to various actions. And it also provides provision for the circumstances in which and the restrictions upon disclosure, which would be subject to an order of the court. That is a new, would be a new development, and it's an important one, and one to be noted, because what it would provide is that the Chief Registering Officer could disclose information of any elector, and that would include biometric information and personal details. But that could only be done by a process which is set out in some detail. And if you look at I think it's section 26, I believe. If you look at it, it sets it out in detail. And what it allows is for an authorized person, which is defined in the proposed legislation, to make an application to a judge of the High Court. And if the judge of the High Court is satisfied and issues an order authorizing the disclosure, then the disclosure could take place. But in the absence of such an order by the court, which has to be substantiated by an affidavit and other processes of the court, no such disclosure could take place. So that really summarizes phase 1 of Sir Dennis's report. Phase 2, trying to run through it quickly. Phase 2 of the report, Sir Dennis indicated that this seeks primarily to address what he refers to as institutional matters. And as I indicated earlier, phase 2 is accompanied by 4 pieces of draft legislation, the 4 pieces I mentioned earlier. Perhaps the most substantive recommendations from phase 2 of the report are reflected in the House of Assembly Elections Act 2023, which I refer to as the new House of Assembly Elections Act. And these are namely are to be found primarily at Clause 50 of Part 3, which deals with access to the media, Part 4, which deals with use of electronic voting systems for the purpose of voting, and Part 5, which deals with campaign financing. These are all new provisions and would introduce new aspects to Dominica's voting system. The main issues addressed by these new provisions are as follows. Access to the media, which I've indicated is at Clause 50. Clause 50, access to the media proposes a substantive change, and it would introduce a mandatory requirement for political parties and independent candidates to be granted access to state-owned media during the campaign period. So effectively, it would give political parties and independent candidates an entitlement to be allowed to have access and air their views on the state-owned media. Note, it's confined, insofar as Sir Dennis's recommendation is concerned, to state-owned media and not private media. The report proposes that access be on the principles of total impartiality, non-discrimination, and equal time. And it also proposes that the Electoral Commission will be required to monitor the equitable airtime and issue directives as necessary to media agencies. And Clause 54 of the new proposed act defines campaign period. And for the purposes of time, I will not read out what I have here, but you can look at it if you turn to Clause 54 either now or subsequently. Part 4, which is comprised of clauses 51 to 53, deals with electronic voting, and so the report recommends that elections should be conducted by means of approved electronic voting systems. However, there are a number of conditions and criteria that are set out by Sir Dennis in his report, which would need to be satisfied before it would be appropriate, in his view, for electronic voting systems to be utilized for the purposes of elections. And this, of course, is a matter which can, and I suspect will, form part of the deliberations during the consultancy. Part 5, which is clause 54 to 75, deal with political campaign financing. And as I indicated, this is a substantive change from the existing landscape insofar as Dominica's political system is concerned. So Dennis made the following observation in relation to campaign financing, as follows, open quotes. The regulation of political and campaign financing is not new to the Commonwealth Caribbean. Elements of regulation of campaign financing can be found in the legislation of some countries in the region, although the only one to have enacted a comprehensive regulatory framework is Jamaica. Close quotes. So Dennis's observation notwithstanding, the proposals contained in this part would without doubt be an entirely new introduction to the electoral landscape in Dominica and would necessarily involve careful consideration and debate. The recommendations would provide the following for governing the sources from which political parties and candidates can obtain funding and the limits to be placed upon contributions to, expenditure by, and use made of those funds by political parties and candidates. Clauses 54 to 63 deal explicitly with campaign contributions and the limits to those, what constitutes acceptance, in what circumstances the recipient would be required to return those funds, failing which there would be consequences, in what circumstance those funds could be forfeited, the permissible uses that can be made of those funds, and the record keeping that the political parties and candidates must comply with in order to conform with the new proposed legislation. Clauses 64 to 65 deal with expressly with campaign expenditure and really just deals with the limits that are placed upon those. Clauses 66 to 75 are of general impact in relation to campaign financing. And they really deal, I suppose the main feature is that they deal with submission of reports and audited returns and the publication of reports by the Electoral Commission. The Electoral Commission would be given the authority to publish those reports if it so chooses. Important also in that, that part of the proposed legislation dealing with campaign finances are clauses 57.3, 64.3, and 64.4, 68.4, 69.3, and 69.4, and clause 70. Those clauses they propose the creation of offenses and maximum penalties which could be imposed in relation to those offenses. And those penalties range from $6,000 or 12 months imprisonment, which would be applicable to clause 57.3, to $10,000, which would be applicable to clauses 64.3, 69.3, and 69.4, and $10,000 or 12 months imprisonment, which would be applicable to clause 70. Part 7, which comprises clauses 91 to 94, deals with election petitions, and largely it reflects the existing position as regards election petitions, save that Sir Dennis has provided a draft House of Assembly elections petitions rules, which the report proposes should be adopted and used as the rules which govern would govern election petitions if the bill were enacted, at least until the Chief Justice revokes or amends those provisions. And 6, which is the final provision that I'm going to deal with, deals with the Electoral Commission, and the report makes recommendations for changes to be made in relation to the Electoral Commission. The principal among these are that the proposed introduction of an Electoral Commission Act 2023, which it is proposed would govern the operation and functioning of the Commission. The proposed introduction of a greater level of financial autonomy for the Commission, and that's dealt with at Clause 12 and of the Electoral Commission Act, and it proposes establishment of the Electoral Commission Fund, and for annual payments of a specified amount into the fund, and for administration by the fund, of the fund by the Chief Elections Officer. It would also provide for staffing, and Clause 8 proposes autonomy to the Commission in the appointment of staff, and also it proposes mandatory requirement for members of the Commission or of any committee established by the Commission, the Chief Elections Officer or any employee of the Commission to be required to disclose any private interest that he or she has in relation to a matter that is being considered. And, and that is found at Clause 19 of the Electoral Commission Act. So in a nutshell, that is a summary of the recommendations and the provisions of the draft legislation proposed by Sir Dennis. There are other matters, some of which others may consider to be significant, but those are the matters that I consider to be of greatest significance and necessary to share with you this evening. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Attorney General, for the brief overview of the recommendations. Before I open up the floor, I would want to perhaps introduce to you our guests who are here representing the various organizations that I spoke about. This is the first time we're having the consultation, so I think it would be appropriate to let you know now who they are and perhaps invite them to say a few words. Honorable Mr. Justice Raphael Masaga is a retired judge of the Court of Appeal of Kenya. In addition to his distinguished years of service at the bar and bench, Justice Masaga chaired the Judiciary Committee on Elections leading to the 2017 general elections in Kenya and has handled many election petitions, including the presidential election petition in 1997 and the Nairobi governor election petition in 2017. He is here to represent the Commonwealth Secretariat. Justice Masaga, I know that it was a very long journey for you to come here to Dominica, and we are very grateful for your presence. Please, can you come and share with us a few words?
Your Excellency, the Prime Minister, distinguished guests, good evening. My name has already been pronounced by the chair of the session. I come from Kenya, East Africa. I'm a retired judge of the Court of Appeal after serving in the judiciary for 35 years and also in the private practice for 10 years. So the total number of years in the legal profession is actually 45 years. As rightly pronounced, I dealt with so many electoral matters, and it's my pleasure to share my experience with you. I'm a nominee of the Secretary General of the Commonwealth, and I'll be happy to sit and listen to the deliberations of the wonderful people of Dominica and wish you all the best. From what I've read, this is people-driven, and I think you all have the passion to make sure that at the end of the day, it shall impact positively to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justice Mishaga. I also wish to introduce you to Ms. Meline Glean from the OAS, who has more than 20 years' experience in international relations, diplomacy, and political analysis with a focus on the Caribbean region. She has worked in the OAS Secretariat for Strengthening Democracy since 2014 advising on political trends and developments in CARICOM member states of the OAS, and supporting the development and deployment of OAS electoral observer missions in several CARICOM states. I believe she was here for the last elections in Dominica. Ms. Glynn, could you please say a few words?
Thank you, Ms. Barron. Good evening, everyone. I was indeed here for the general elections in 2022. I was the deputy chief of that mission, and I was also deputy chief for our mission in 2019. It is good to be here once again. I bring you greetings from the OS Secretary General. We are pleased to have this opportunity to collaborate with Dominica once more, and we look forward to listening to what you have to say and taking our results back to the OS Secretary General. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Glynn. Mr. Sas Gunraj represents the CARICOM Secretariat. He's an attorney at law in private practice at the Guyana Bar. He has been a commissioner of the Guyana Elections Commission from 2015 to present. He was a member of the UNASOR, the Union of South American Nations Electoral Observer Mission in Bolivia in 2015, a member of the CARICOM Electoral Observer Mission in St. Lucia in 2021, and Chief of Mission for the CARICOM Elections Observation Mission to St. Kitts and Nevis in 2022. So, Mr. Gunraj, please.
Good evening, all. Protocol having been established, allow me to adopt it, please. It gives me great pleasure to participate in this consultative process with Dominica as a nominee of the CARICOM Secretary General. From our perspective, in terms of the Guyana experience, this is a road that we have walked in terms of legislation and legislative changes. And as many of you would also know, from an electoral perspective, we've had our challenges. That being said, we look forward to participating in this process with the people of Dominica, and we wish you well in these proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gunraj. And last but by no means least, Mr. Dwight Lay represents the OECS Commission. He's a barrister and has functioned as a legal representative of the government of St. Lucia, locally, regionally, and internationally. He has professional experience in both the theory and practice of regional and international trade and public administration, and he's currently the General Counsel of the OECS. Mr. Lay, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good evening to everyone. Protocol has been established, and I would like the opportunity to adopt it. These proceedings are very important for the OECS from the perspective of the OECS as a regional institution. And we see what's taken place in Dominica as a good example for other member states of the sub-region. We do appreciate the sensitivity of the issue and the varying interests which are all at stake and will be, I guess, articulated and settled in the process. The Director General of the OECS and the member states also, I think, observing this very keenly. And on behalf of the organization, I would like to say that we are, in fact, very happy to be observers at this process, because it will assist us in moving forward as a regional institution which has the interest of its member states at heart. So we look forward to the next couple of days and would be very interested in the proceedings that will be taking place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you, and we're very pleased to have you here in Dominica. You would have heard from the Attorney General a synopsis of some of the key points arising from the report of Sir Dennis. Some of you may be happy with the report, some may think it goes too far, Some may think that it does not go far enough. You will all have the opportunity to share your views and perspectives on this and to say to the government what you would like to see be taken to the Parliament to modernize our electoral process. You would see that the government is very much interested in what you have to say. The Prime Minister is here, his cabinet ministers are here as well. So I know that we are joined by persons online and persons in the room, members of the Bar Association. The persons who are online can always raise their hand so that they can indicate if they wish to make any comments. We would like everyone to have an opportunity to speak, so we ask that you keep your intervention succinct and to the point so that everyone will get a chance to speak. Everybody's view is important, and we ask that we all show respect and allow people to share their views uninterrupted. Because there are several issues arising out of Sir Dennis's recommendations, I propose that we deal with the main issues one by one, and thereafter, if there are other matters that you wish to raise arising out of his report, then you can do so. Please be reminded that, as well, that you also have the opportunity to submit your comments and feedback in writing. And if you wish to do so, they can be sent to Ms. Karen Prevost, the Cabinet Secretary, at the Cabinet Secretariat, the 6th floor of the Financial Center on Kennedy Avenue. I wish to invite the Mrs. Didier Knight, if she wants to share the position of the Dominica Bar on the recommendations of Sir Dennis. If she is minded to do so now, you're invited to do so. If there is the position of the bar that you would want to share with us. So, Mrs. Knight, Didier.
Thank you, Mrs. Baron Roy. Protocol has been established already. I will adopt it, save that I will acknowledge the presence of the Honorable Prime Minister and other ministers of government. Madam Chairperson, the Bar Association as an association does not have a position on the legislation, on the proposed legislation. We have not met and sat and come to any consensus on the proposed legislation. I think probably it would be almost impossible, I think, to have lawyers with analytical minds, independent minds, to actually sit and come to an agreement on and have a joint position on this matter. But having said that, I know that individual lawyers do have their position, and I think that everyone who comes to the podium this evening and expresses their position, that those will be their personal views and not necessarily the views of the Dominica Bar Association. I also note that every single member of the bar was invited to this evening's consultation and not solely the Bar Association. For those who don't know, and until we have the Legal Profession Act passed, hopefully it will be sooner rather than later, not every member of the bar is a member of the Bar Association. So that some members of the bar are not, and so they can come and give their position. Every member of the bar can simply come and give their position on the act. Ms. Nesty, I see you smiling at me. I'm not sure why. Okay, and having said, I do have my own personal views on the legislation, but I know that there are lawyers here who are more senior than I am, and in the tradition of the profession, I would certainly allow them to proceed before I do. I see Mr. Richards is there, Mr. Stowe is there, who are more senior than I am. I also see online Ms. Lisa De Freitas, who is also more senior than I, and Ms. Augustus. I see Mr. Astefan, of course, SC is present. So I will allow them first, and then I will step in my turn.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm not sure. You want me to do? We have mics available, so if anybody indicates their interest in making a presentation, then the person will bring the mic to you. As I indicated, to ensure that we capture all of the points, we want to take them point by point. So the Attorney General would have spoken about the qualification for registration and remaining registered. And a number of issues arise here. And I will just name a few, you may have others. The question of the removal of persons from the register who have been absent from Dominica for more than 5 years. Should the 5-year restriction be removed altogether? Should it be 10 years? What should constitute absence? 90 days, 50 days, 5 days? Should there be any restriction at all? I'm just putting those questions out there so that it can tease your mind when you get up to make your presentation. The Attorney General spoke about the feedback, well, allowing 17-year-olds to register. And so as soon as they become 18, their registration would take effect. He also spoke about a new register to be created, and to avoid disenfranchising persons already on the register, a confirmation process will take place. So questions can arise: should all confirmations take place in Dominica? Should the Electoral Commission go to Dominicans in different cities? Should confirmation be allowed by virtual means? So these are just some of the questions. Should identification cards for voting be mandatory? Should the ID cards be solely for voting, or should they be multi-purpose? So these are just some of the questions that arise. So I'm not sure if anybody wants to take the floor to speak to any of those issues. It can be here or virtually. So the floor is open. Mr. Gilden Richards, can we bring the mic to him? The Attorney General is here as well if you require any clarification on any matters.
Good evening, Madam Chairman.
I'm not sure the mic is working. Yes.
Okay. Madam Chairman, good evening, Honorable Prime Minister, Ministers of Government, invited guests.
Gilden, if you can, probably.
Sorry. Pleased to be here to make my humble contribution to this consultation. Madam Chairman, I start with the House of Assembly elections recommendation. Madam Chairman, my first concern is in Clause 11. I think Clause 11 refers to the issuance of the writ. I don't know if it can be shown on the screen.
Go ahead. They will try to put it up on the screen. Maybe you can just say what Clause 11 says.
Madam Chairwoman, I say Chairman all the time, Chairwoman. I believe there should be a fixed date for election at a fixed month every 5 years. I believe that is one of the most fundamental changes we need to make if we are going to have true control as a people of our election process. I do not believe, and it's not personal what I'm going to say, I do not believe the Prime Minister should hold election date in his pocket at his convenience to be declared whenever he so chooses. Anybody can see the unfairness in this because the Prime Minister is likely to choose the day that is most suitable to him but most inconvenient to his opponents. I pray that we give serious consideration to this recommendation. Madam Chairwoman, identification cards and not national identification cards are the only cards which are truly within the constitutional purview of the Electoral Commission. That is the card that Justice Byron should have recommended, and not multi-purpose national identification card. The reason is simple. the complications are clear. First, to permit the Electoral Commission to make and issue national identification card is to transfer to it a jurisdiction that rightly belongs to some other part of government. The Electoral Commission is not responsible for citizenship, nor is it responsible for immigration. This is a critical point. Further, the Electoral Commission has no jurisdiction to issue such a card because it cannot choose, as Justice Byron observed, to issue that card to which all citizens are entitled, to only those citizens who are entitled to vote. And Madam Chairwoman, we recall the first attempt to pass in our parliament legislation to that effect. I was the person who filed the injunction prior to its reintroduction, the reintroduction of the bill in Parliament, for good reason. Madam Chairwoman, I'd like us to refer to the first phase report at page 25, sorry. And there you will see that Justice Byron raises the same issues almost identically that I rose in those proceedings in relation to the difficult issue of imposing on the Electoral Commission an unconstitutional duty to make and issue national identification cards. Therefore, it is beyond my understanding why Justice Byron would even recommend national identification card after he has made some strong point against it on that page of his report. I respect Justice Byron very much, but I think in this regard, he has made a fundamental error. Madam Chairwoman, I have other points that I can make now. I don't want to dominate these proceedings, so I will sit for us to digest the issues that I have given air to, because these are the fundamental issues. And I propose respectfully, and I hope the Prime Minister can understand. I don't know if he will look at me and see that I'm referring to him. You can understand, Mr. Prime Minister, the grave difficulty we would have to prepare the necessary legislation that must involve an amendment of the Constitution by way of referendum to get a national ID card process going before the next election. And I hope the visitors here from abroad who are hearing me will make a particular note in this regard, because this is a burning issue for all Dominicans. The Electoral Commission now, today, in law, has the jurisdiction to issue national ID cards, voter ID cards. If you look at Regulation 15 of the existing law, registration of electors regulations, you will see that it caters for identification card. The parent law permits identification cards to be made. Regulation 15 says, when required. Voter ID card has been required since the last 5 elections, if not more. It's only an amendment of the existing law to give it that effect. Again, Mr. Prime Minister, I'm urging you to do what I'm sure you know is right.
So just to be clear, Mr. Richards,
yes,
you are in favor of identification cards being used for
yes,
elections?
yes.
But you are favoring voter
ID cards.
as opposed to national ID
Yes,
cards.
because voter ID
Okay.
cards are the only
I get you.
cards the Commission has jurisdiction to
Okay.
issue.
I understand your point.
So I rest for your digestion of this point, because this is the main point I wish to make here. I
Okay.
may make other points.
You can
But
always come in later
We
to make other
cannot
points.
go into a next election without giving effect to the laws on the book now. And cleaning the voters list is another one. The law is there. It's the enforcement of the law that is being delayed, and it's being delayed by a denial of resources to the Electoral Commission to do those simple things for us to have free, transparent, and honest election.
Thank you for your contribution. Please note that that all your comments are being recorded, so they're being taken note of. I believe we have online Jeffrey Douglas Murdoch. Can you come in? Can you unmute and come in, please, and let us have your comments?
Yes, Madam Chairman. Greetings, good evening. I hope you can hear me well enough. I'm just curious, as an American who's also a Dominican, but born and raised in America, for the past 40 years, I have been able to cast my absentee ballot. So I'm wondering, you put a teaser out there as to, should we consider a time frame for when Dominicans are in Dominica? Well, my right to vote in America has not been abridged by being out of America for 40 years. So I'm just wondering, what's the consideration there? Why there would even be a constraint on how much time you've been away from Dominica?
Thank you, Mr. Murdoch. Well, that's one of the things that we have to discuss here, whether there should in fact be a constraint or not. I think Senior Counsel Astafan wants to come in.
Yes, Madam Chairperson, I do. I'm very happy with what my friend Jeffrey just said, because recent events are fairly, well, first of all, forgive my bad manners. I abide with the protocol. I want to thank the observers for coming. In fact, I want to invite the Prime Minister for inviting them. I'm happy they're here based on what their introductions. It's fairly clear to me that they have clear knowledge of election law. I recall Mr. Dwight Lee from St. Lucia. I am very sorry I'm not in Dominica. I would have loved to have spoken to the judge from Kenya about his election petition matters, and then I could discuss mine with him that I've had since 2005. But be that as it may, I want to start with what Mr. Murdoch said. And Mr. Murdoch has a point that we have to consider, even if some may not like it. In 2009, I think it was, St. Kitts moved away from the sole criteria for registration being residence, and created, how should I put it, a ground for registration of voting called domicile, because their constitution as well as ours require residence or domicile for the purposes of registration. And once registered, you have the right to vote regardless of how long you've been overseas. And I'll get to that in a minute. Domicile in St. Kitts meant that if you lived in the country before you traveled to the diaspora, you have a right under the legislation to register in the constituency in which you resided before you left. And even if you were born in New York and never as a child resided in St. Kitts and Nevis, domicile included or gave the right to the citizen, because of his parents being Kittitian, the right to register either in the constituency in which his mother lived, her mother lived, and if she was never a citizen of St. Kitts and Nevis, then where the father would have resided. That was 2009. In recent times, we have seen Commonwealth countries like Britain, for argument's sake, removing the 15-year rule on the right to vote. Canada removing the 5-year list the 5-year rule to vote. Australia has done the same thing. I don't know what's the position in Africa, so we'll soon find out. And the developing international best practices to give the right to citizens to vote, either in the constituency in which they may have lived before they travel, for however long they may have been overseas. I think serious consideration needs to be made to removing the 5-year rule. In the globalized world in which we live, and the transient and the immigration, the migration of citizens who go elsewhere for greener pastures should not be punished for not being able to travel back for 10 days or 14 days or 5 days or even 1 day. And I think serious consideration needs to be given to that. On the question of cleansing the list, Mr. Richards is right, the law is there, but the law has nothing to do with resources. The failure to object, let me put it this way, for the benefit of the consultant. Our current legislation requires every electoral list to be published in all the constituencies with a very clear notice that you have the right to object to anybody whose name is on the list if you believe they may not have been resident in the constituency or in the existence of the old law overseas for more than 5 years. I who have done election petitions in Antigua from 1997, in Dominica from 2005, I am not aware of any objection to anybody's name on the list simply because they've been overseas for more than 5 years. Objections are not made because the political party is marching to the election with the view that they're going to win, and when they lose, suddenly the voters list is corrupt, is bloated, it stinks. And we have had 2 previous Chief Justices in decisions made by the court that you cannot complain about the list if you do nothing in the intermittent years to have people's names removed from the voters list. And it's not an easy task. For the benefit of the consultants, our Court of Appeal, in the case which I lost in Nevis, made it clear that you cannot remove persons from the voters list unless they are the strictest compliance with the protection of the law. So the suggestion that one could simply unilaterally remove people from the voters list is something that I have a serious problem with. I also have a problem with this idea of fixed date for election because that requires a constitutional amendment. And that's not part of the ambit of electoral reform. We have to be careful we don't cross the boundaries and trespass into something different. So take, for example, between 2014 and 2019, between the 2 elections, for the benefit of the consultants, there were 30 objections or 20 objections, 17 in one. I forgot the precise number, 17 in one constituency, 1 each in the other constituency. Once the president's writs were issued, the opposition forces decided to file over 1,000 notices of objections after the election have been declared, with the election being due within 21 days. So part of the problem, ladies and gentlemen, that we have with the list is that the politicians have failed to act in ensuring the list is cleansed through the process of objection. On the question of ID card,
so
Mr.
Before you move to the ID cards, so just to conclude on that point, so Mr. Richards, you're agreeing with Mr. Richards that the law as it stands could have led to a cleansing of the list. Now, Sir Dennis has suggested additional changes to help that process along. Do you have any comments on the additional changes that he has introduced? For example, a positive requirement on public officials to provide information to the Electoral Commission.
Any recommendation that will lead to the unilateral removal of persons from the voters list or will lead to the disenfranchisement of one citizen, whether here or New York or in Kenya, is a recommendation that I will publicly oppose. I will publicly oppose it. The confirmation process is one thing. If you have a confirmation process, not a re-registration process, but a confirmation process, and persons do not come to be confirmed as maybe one of the bases upon which you can be removed, and you don't turn up, you're just not interested, and you're removed from the voters list, I don't have an issue with that. But I have a serious issue of getting information from immigration or customs or the police and going through the list and say, Tony Estefan's been away for 6 years, take him off the list without any notice to me. Our Court of Appeal has made it clear that that would violate the protection of the law for any person who's registered as a voter to remove them from the list. So I make the point so the consultants don't get this idea in their head that names are being snuck in the middle of the night to bloat the list or to contaminate the list with people who are not duly qualified to be registered. Because the lists are published, everybody has the right to object the name in the specific constituency to object to persons on the voters list, and that has consistently not been done over the years. The one other point that I want to make is the issue of ID cards. There's no constitutional issue there. The Parliament is the one vested with the authority to make laws for the purposes of election, not the Electoral Commission. The only obligation the Cabinet may have or the responsible minister may have is to consult with the Electoral Commission. It is for the Parliament to make a decision on what is required for the purposes of identification. Mr. Lay will tell you, in St. Lucia, you could use your passport, your driver's license, or any government issued license, ID card with a photograph. Why do we, in a country such as ours, without a history of fraudulent voting or personation voting, have to put people through the process of giving biometrics, getting fingerprinted, getting photographed, like the criminals traveling somewhere for a visa or something like that? So my simple point, Madam Chair, I intend to participate throughout this consultation. We must not make the process difficult for people to vote. We must not make it a suggestion of a program for disenfranchisement, especially of our people in the diaspora, because in 2005, those intellectuals who are now seeking to condemn the right of the diasporans to vote said in writing that it would be disrespectful to the diaspora and the diasporians to deny them the right to vote because of their consistent fiscal and financial contribution to the development of the country. How do you tell a man that has been sending remittances to the country, or a woman, for the last how many years, that you cannot have the right to vote because you live overseas, or you can't spend 40 days or 90 days in Dominica within 5 or 10 years? That's wrong. So all that I'm saying is, let us keep our minds open. Let us look at the effect of some of these recommendations. Some of them are wholly new to the Caribbean, and whether or not the Prime Minister and the Cabinet and the Parliament wants to make us the guinea pig for new election laws that have not been tested in the Caribbean, that's a matter for them. But we have an obligation to speak out during the consultation process, and I intend to do so throughout the process. I don't wish to stay any longer, Madam Chair, because I know others want to address the...
Thank you, Senior Counsel. Before you go back, Gilden, is there anybody else that wants to speak to any of these points? Online? Mr. Richards, you have the floor. Can we have the mics, please? 1 second.
Yes, Madam Chairwoman. I've listened to Mr. Estefan, and I don't think he's serious when he says that Parliament makes the law and not the Commission. I believe he misses the point fundamentally. It is Parliament cannot contravene the Constitution. And the Constitution specifically says what the Electoral Commission can do. It therefore means that you cannot, by ordinary legislation, impose a duty on the Electoral Commission. You must amend the Constitution. And Justice Byron makes the point at page 25 of his first phase report. I wish we could have it on the screen to see the enormous difficulty, okay, it entails to get that process done before the next election.
I don't think that's exactly the point that senior counsel made, but
please,
the point is this.
Do not defend the senior counsel.
The point is
he
this,
has himself to defend.
Mr. Richards, if I may. Yes. The point is whether or not we should have an ID card for elections. And I think you agree that we should have ID cards. Your disagreement is as to whether it should be national voter ID cards or national ID cards. And your point has been taken that you're saying that it cannot be national ID cards, that it should be voter ID cards. So I've taken that point.
Madam Chairwoman, I respectfully believe you are preempting me.
But you said so before.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
You have missed the point, just like Mr. Astafad. It is a violation of the Constitution to impose upon the Electoral Commission any other duty than those duties that are specific to election.
I understand that.
The issuance and making of national ID card is not within that ambit.
Okay, thank you very much. On the question of the confirmation process, does anyone have any comments in relation to that? Sorry, please. Sure.
I think we can see why we don't have a joint statement. Huh? Madam Chair, with your permission, I will just give my general comments on the entire thing as I have prepared it. Firstly, Madam Chairperson, I wish to commend Sir Dennis and his team for their time, their effort, and work put into the research and consultation process and the report and the draft laws. It is indisputable, I would say, that by and large, the draft laws represent what can be seen as a significant progression in our electoral laws. For example, the propositions propose to take our electoral laws from a position of saying nothing at all on the issues of campaign financing and campaign expenditure to introducing new provisions specifically dealing with these issues and placing limits on same. This is commendable. To the extent that the 800 or so people who participated in the survey represent a snapshot of Dominican society, these provisions were highly desired by the populace and they are here. We should adopt them. Other highly desirable outcomes from the survey were, among other things, the cleansing or the sanitization of the voters list, voter identification, and the issue of treating and bribery. With regard to the latter, although the specific question of the transportation of voters into Dominica from overseas was not a question specifically asked in the survey, it is well known, I would posit, that this is a matter on the minds of many Dominicans. It has formed a part of various election petitions, protests, etc. So I wish to speak to these few issues and to put my queries and suggestions. Before that, however, I would say, Madam Chairperson, that my overarching recommendation today really, or this evening, is that this type of forum, we can get general ideas, but I do not think that we can take from this forum real specific, concrete recommendations on every aspect of the law. I think time doesn't allow it, the situation, the circumstance doesn't allow it, and my recommendation would be for a committee to be formed comprising of at least 1 or 2 representatives from civil society organizations and the political parties to really take an in-depth review of the legislation and propose any changes, to go through it line by line, roll up your sleeves, as a friend of mine would say, roll up your sleeves and get to work and go line by line on that legislation and see what can be done or what needs not to be done. And the committee would, of course, I would believe, bring forward contributions from members of their respective organizations. If I could address first the cleansing of the voters list. There are two options for cleansing the voters list. We can have a re-registration process or a confirmation process. As we see, the draft laws propose the latter, a confirmation process. And that confirmation process is set out in Part 5 of the Registration of Electors Act and the regulations. Based on the process, the confirmation of deceased persons, I would say, should be almost impossible, except in the case of serious fraud. Regulation 53.2c, however, states that an applicant for confirmation will be disallowed if the applicant, being a citizen of Dominica, has been absent from Dominica for a period of more than 5 years as determined pursuant to the provisions of the Act. And we have just seen that the definition of being absent from Dominica for more than 5 years is that 90-day, whether you have spent an accumulation of 90 days within the country or 50 days, Sir Dennis is suggesting either 50 or 90. As to the issue of whether that provision should be there or not, that the issue of absence, when I reviewed the report and I reviewed the surveys, this was not an issue that people opposed, that they didn't want persons who were, it is not that people opposed that part of our legislation that said persons who were absent from Dominica for 5 years should not be permitted to vote or should not be permitted to vote. People were not opposed to that part of our legislation. So it is there. I think Sir Byron is simply trying to clarify it and to clarify the definition of what absence is. According to his report, that is the vexing issue. Not a question of whether they should be permitted to vote or not, but what does absence mean? I think that is what he got from all of his consultations, surveys, and so on with the populace. So if that is the issue, the question then really is that, do we like that definition of being absent, meaning not being in Dominica for an accumulation of 90 days or 50 days? I think it's fine. In my personal view, I think the 90-day provision is fine. Persons may argue that, well, people contribute to the finances and that provision should not be there at all. I don't think that that was a question that Dominicans really was bothered with. They didn't have an issue with it at all. It was just the meaning of what is absence. Is it 1 day? If you come to Dominica for 1 day during a period of 5 years, is that sufficient? No, I think Sir Byron, in his consultations, realized that it needed more than 1 day. He suggested 50 to 90, and I think that that is fine. What I am concerned with, Madam Chair, is that the regulations do not provide sufficient particulars of the requirements to show that you are disallowed under the section dealing with absence from Dominica. So the regulations provide a form, Form 31, and that form requires a statement as to one's residency. So under the confirmation process, you fill up a form and you say why you should remain on the register. And that form gives you one of the questions is to your residential status. And you simply put in there what your residential status is. And I think that that's all the regulations say in relation to that. And I suppose it is hoped that there will be a level of honesty there to say, I am not resident in Dominica, I am resident overseas, which would then allow the registering officer, the confirmation officer to ask further questions. But I don't think our legislation should rely on one's honesty only. That's why we have legislation. So I think that the legislation, or in that form, there should be more probing questions as to one's residency and to one's absence from the state. And some of those probing questions could be, do you have a second citizenship? Do you have a residency status not only in Dominica but outside of Dominica? Because persons can reside in two places, or you can reside in two places. And those questions, I think, if those questions were on the form, it would lead then to the registering or the confirmation officer asking for more information or seeking, for instance, one's passport. I mean, why is there an absence really of a requirement for a passport if you reside overseas? So if we agree and if we are saying that that requirement is okay, that requirement of absence from Dominica for more than 5 years is okay, and we agree with that and we accept that, then to ensure that when the confirmation comes in, you confirm yourself on the register you must provide proof of it. There must be some provision of proof of it. It cannot just be filling up a form and saying where you reside. There must be some mandatory requirement to show that you have not been absent from the state for more than 5 years. And from what I can see, the legislation doesn't provide for that, and it ought to. And also that form 31, we notice as well that it is not a declaration. So when you apply to register to vote, to be on the list, to be on the register of electors, the form is actually a declaration. And there's a notice at the bottom which tells you if you put anything in there that is false, then you could be liable to be imprisoned and so on and so forth, and it is an offense. That declaration is not on the confirmation form, and I think it ought to be there in Form 31. It ought to be there. It ought to be a declaration. It is not required that it is witnessed like the registration form. I'm not sure why. Probably it ought to be witnessed, but it certainly ought to be a declaration, and there ought to be that provision there that says if you say anything on the form that is not true, that you will be liable to be, that it would be an offense. And we note at rule or in the regulations, Regulation 27(1)(e), that this is the section that deals with the Electoral Commission being able to ask for records from the registry, from the minister, from the permanent secretary, and so on. And those are mandatory requirements. So in other words, it says, I don't know if we can pull it up, Regulation 27, it says that the chief electoral of the Electoral Commission can, or they may ask for records, or that they shall receive records from the registry, they shall receive records from the permanent secretary, and so on, and this is with regard to deaths, births, absence from the state, and so on. But in relation to the immigration records, we see that there's no mandatory requirement. It doesn't use the word shall, it uses the word may. So it says that the officer may request this information of the immigration authorities, and we wonder why that one is not mandatory, where all the rest are. Again, if we are going ahead with the absence requirement, with the absence definition, then the obligation for the immigration to provide records regarding one's absence from the state must be mandatory. One may say that it might be onerous on the immigration authorities to do. I say, in this day and age of technology and AI, there must be a way to pull out those records. Not every single piece of record from the immigration office, but those records simply dealing with one's absence from the state or one's ins and outs if you are not resident in the state. There must be a way to do it, and it should be mandatory as well. And again, I think doing that would help with the integrity of the list, because we do not want a situation where 20 years down the line, we are back to the situation where we are right now and wanting to cleanse the voters list because we have this confirmation period, it's done, it's over with, and then nothing else happens after that. Yes, there is an onus on the political parties and civil society to object to persons on the list, but we all know the difficulties with that. How do I, if I wanted to object to someone on the list, how would I find out whether that person has been absent from the state or not? It's almost impossible. And I believe that might be the reason why there has never been an objection. There's no way for someone to really find out. The persons who can really find out and mandate those records is the election office. Those are the people who can find out, and the law should provide for them to find out and to receive those records mandatorily. In relation to the publication, we haven't reached there yet, Madam Chair, but the publication of the lists. Go ahead. Yes, we know that there is in the legislation inconsistency or gaps in relation to how the lists and registers are published, and in some cases when they are published. So for example, Section 15 of the Register of Electors Act, it says that the supplementary list says when. It says when it is to be published, but it doesn't say how. And then in the revised supplementary list, it says how it is to be published, that is in the Gazette and on the website, but it doesn't say when it is to be published. And this section, it says that it is to be published on the website, on the Gazette. But however, when we look in the regulations, they do not mandate publication of any list or register on the website. And we wonder why. Is there a security reason why it should not be published on the website? I'm not sure. In this day and age, the registers, the list should be published on the website. To me, it is a straightforward matter, and I'm not sure why the regulations do not permit that or do not mandate that. It says in the regulations that copies of the list should be made available in certain places and so on, and you get the impression that it is the physical list, but this is passive. I'm not saying that it should not be made available. It must be made available, but it must also be made available on the website. That needs to be in the regulation. On the issue of ID cards, it appears, Madam Chair, that although the term national ID card is used in the proposed legislation, what the card legislated for, or the proposed legislation really legislates for, is a voter ID card. I mean, I share the AG's opinion that it's a non-issue, in the sense that, as Mr. Richards contends that the Electoral Commission does not have the jurisdiction to issue national ID cards, but the proposed legislation, what it's doing is really giving them jurisdiction is really giving them the power to issue voter ID cards. So it calls it a national ID card, but what it says is you can only receive this card if you're registered to vote. So if you can only receive the card when you're registered to vote as a voter, how can it possibly be a national ID card? It is a voter registration card. It's a voter ID card. That's what it is. So I think that if that is what it is, let's call it what it is. Unless, of course, Sir Byron is saying that for the national ID card to really take effect or to really have life, then there are other pieces of legislation that need to be passed together with it to give it life. And unless those pieces of legislation are there and ready to go and impending, then let's forget the idea. Let's just call it what it is. It's a voter ID card. And all that requires is just switching out the name from national ID card to voter ID card. Unless, of course, we have those pieces of legislation there waiting, then let's see them and let's go with it. And if at all in the future we do have those pieces of legislation to give life to a national ID card, then it is a simple matter of going in and amending the legislation, if needs be. With the national ID card, again, I think that one of the important facts, what the surveys said, according to Sir Byron's report, and what people wanted to see on the national ID cards are the biometric data, and that the cards are updated periodically. And we wonder how the legislation really addresses these things. The legislation, it says at Regulation 13 that a national identification card issued pursuant to Regulation 10.3d shall be in the form as set out in Form 7 in the first schedule, and shall be signed by the Chief Registering Officer and have such security features as the Chief Registering Officer considers appropriate. I don't think that that is sufficient. I think that that is very much in general terms. Yes, it gives the Chief Registering Officer some flexibility, but it's not enough. It doesn't put in the basic things that people said that they wanted in the survey, which is some biometric data, your photograph. The legislation asks, when you're confirming and when you're registering, it asks for your photograph. So if it asks for your photograph, it asks for your information, why not simply put it in the legislation, in the regulations, that at the minimum, your photo must be in the card. Okay, your photo must be on the card. Form 7 right now is blank. So we don't know what it's going to look like. It's blank right now. So in the very least, I think it needs to have that your face. It's an ID card, so it needs to have your face. And it needs to have, of course, your name, your voter ID registration number, and your constituency. It needs to have those things, and I think the regulations need to say that these things need to be there as a minimum. And of course, still leaving the Chief Registering Officer to decide anything else that he may require. And finally, on the issue of bribery and treating, as I said, one of the vexing issues has been the transportation of voters from outside of Dominica for the purpose of voting. Now, the law states that a corrupt intent has to be proven for this or any other action, for that matter, to be deemed bribery or treating. That is one of the most difficult things to prove. However, one of the functions of legislation, I think, is to clarify the law in relation to current issues, and indeed to simply legislate for current pressing issues. If that has been identified as a current and vexing issue, the legislation needs to address it directly. Okay, it has been identified, the survey has said so, it is there. or if the survey doesn't say so sufficiently, let's do another one to see. But I think the election petitions, the protests, etc., is sufficient evidence to show that it is a vexing issue in Dominica. And I think that the legislation just simply needs to address it directly. If it's not treating, say it's not treating. If it is, say it is. Or if it is, whether if you don't want to call it treating, if you want to make it just unlawful, and I think that might be a solution, to just simply make it unlawful to bring in voters or to pay for the passages of voters to come into Dominica to vote. So this legislation simply needs to address it. And I think that that is it for my part. I think there's a lot more to be said, and I think there's more to be said in relation to the funding of the Electoral Commission. The new act has provided for it, and there's some things to be said there as well. But I think time, we'll leave it at that for now. Madam Chair, before I go, is it possible at all? Right now, I think it is August, and several councillors overseas, not present, on vacation, because this is the time that most of them take their vacation, is during August, because the court is on vacation as well. And I wonder if it might not be possible at all that we can have another consultation or another way. I know you said that we can send in our written submissions, but many people expressed the view that the time was short and that the notice period as well was short. I mean, it wasn't even a week, you know, to give them a chance to really go into this thing and review it. So I wonder if we can have another consultation. I'm putting it out there, and it is for your consideration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think that's my notepad. Probably. Is it? Thank you very much. Just to go with your last point, I would leave that to government to decide whether there would be further consultations, but I think the idea is to try to get as wide a consultation as possible. I think persons would have had access to those reports from June, so there has been time, and one would have expected to be called to come to the consultations, because the Prime Minister would have indicated that he was going to consult everybody. But of course, you can still put in your written submissions. If there is time, bearing in mind that we would want to get this legislation before Parliament before the end of the year. So if there is sufficient time, depending on the scheduling, then that perhaps can be entertained. But I would leave that for government to decide on. You made mention of the possibility of a committee being formed to go through it. The idea of having these consultations is to hear from as wide a cross-section of Dominica as possible, so that everybody has the opportunity to express their views on what they think the electoral reform process should look like. So you don't want to just restrict it to a small set of people. You need to have the views of as wide a cross-section as possible. In addition, right, okay, fine. And again, the government has not expressed its view yet on the report. This is Sir Dennis's report, so we don't know what the government agrees or does not agree with, what the position of the government is on this. The whole idea of this is to look at the report of Sir Dennis to see whether you agree, you disagree, whether you think that there are certain things that should be included that's not included. So we do appreciate the suggestions that have been made, what you have pointed out. All of those things are being recorded for them to be looked at. And of course, we would encourage other persons as well to share their views on the recommendations that have been made as well, and whether there are things in there that they think that are missing that might need to be included as well. On the question of bribery and treating, I think Sir Dennis has dealt with that in his report in terms of what the law is, and what the law and how the courts have interpreted these sections. There's numerous precedents in relation to that. So one should bear that in mind. And of course, I think in relation to the other things that has been noted, I don't know if there's any other comments that anybody would have. Sorry, Madam Registrar, you would like the floor? Sure. Do you want to speak from here, or we have mics?
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. In considering the points that have been ventilated thus far, I would like to also place my position on the ID card, voter ID card. It is not my, and these are the views of myself, it is not my position that we require a national ID card nor a voter ID card. I do think that we require some form of identification. For me to be considered a voter, I must present to the Electoral Commission a government-issued ID or any other ID as required by the Electoral Commission. That in itself can be used to verify my identity in the future. If I need to use some other ID, I can update that issue at any which time. So to place the burdens of the state to issue new cards when becoming a register in the first place, we have already provided our identity, that in itself to me is not necessary. Our legislation long before was in...
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, our legislation long before was in 1974. We have the CARICOM treaties in 1973, correct me if I'm right, I'm wrong. To now place a position for citizens to now move throughout the CARICOM region, free movement, skills persons, and I know sovereignty is an aspect as well, but why would we want to bind our citizens to a time being overseas that we may have obligated duties that render us to serve as CARICOM members for skill works and all other things? I don't think that being away from the state should take away from any citizen the right in which to vote. I don't think in any which way as well that citizens that provide a lot of financial support to the state should be removed from the register as being absent. I don't think, as it states, the legislation says visited and being in the state for 90 days. So it's not even a matter of visiting. You have to visit and be in the state. Well, I don't see how it operates, but it's something you may have to look at in the legislation as well. So that is my position on that. But what concerns me is the 17-year-olds, the registration of the 17-year-olds, the application process and the way that it is being done. Because 17-year-olds may not have IDs. And what exactly, I don't think the legislation ventilated very well what exactly is the process. Is it on the onus on the commission now to move the registration to the electors list, to the registration list as soon as the person becomes 18? Or do I have to come back now and perfect the system or perfect the application process with my ID? One thing we must look at in voting is that we have come a long way and we do not want to make voting hard and we do not want to discourage people from voting. So we have to create processes to encourage voting. We have to create processes to allow people to vote at each time and to allow our citizens to vote. And that's my position.
Thank you very much for your contribution. That is well noted. I think Senior Counsel wants to come in as well. Senior Counsel Astafan?
Yes, I do wish to come back on. Let me start with the question of bribery and cheating. We've had to deal with these in the 2005, 2009, 2019 election petitions. All of them were thrown out. Why? Because every year there's a hue and a cry, 300, 3,000, 10,000 overseas Dominicans come back to vote and they go, and opposition makes the allegations in the petitions, but they don't have, how should I put it, the specifics in order to plead an arguable case, and every single one of these petitions were thrown out. Because every year they say, they mention overseas voters and they come with numbers. But it's important to remember, whatever may be the situation, that bribery and cheating are criminal offenses. They can lead on conviction in the magistrate's court or by petition to fine or imprisonment and disqualification from the parliament for 7 years. And any suggestion to water down, how should I put it, the provisions and the scope of these respective criminal/electoral offenses would be a very dangerous step backwards. And I should say, Sir Dennis recognized that the CCJ, in the decision as to the magisterial jurisdiction of court to deal with matters of treating and bribery, Justice Anderson made it very clear. The giving of money, provision of transportation, and so on, are not treating unless done with the corruptly, meaning with the corrupt intent. So we have that from the highest court of our land. We also have a decision from Justice Glasgow, who heard the 2019 election petition, that said, look, there is nothing in the law that prevents a political party from paying for the transportation for their electors, for their supporters. I mean, every election we do it via bus, via car, and once the, how should I put it, the arrangement is not conditional on asking them to vote for somebody that otherwise they would not vote for, it was not a criminal offense. It simply was not a criminal offense. Same thing with the provisions in relation to treaties. In 2009, Justice Thomas said, bans and alcohol and barbecue pits, or whatever you call it, tins or what they are now part of the cultural regimes of these islands. So the mere having of a ban and selling of alcohol or food would not constitute treating unless done without a corrupt intent. And we have to be vigilant to make sure that what is now considered lawful as to what constitutes bribery and treating, what does not constitute bribery and treating, should not be made absolute offenses and remove the requirement for corrupt intent to be pleaded and established because of the real risk and consequence of imprisonment, fine, and disqualification. On the question of who knows who lives overseas, you would think that we were living on the Asian continent, that we don't know each other. Dominica is one of the largest countries in the Windward Islands, and one of the smallest populations. We all live in a little village or area of residential areas. We know each other. We know who has left. We know who has come back. We know who has come back, and who knows we have gone. And I'll tell you why they also know it, for the benefit of the consultants. In the 2009 election, which the opposition filed in relation to this very issue, and which they lost, and were represented then by one of the very best in the Caribbean, my beloved friend, my dear friend and brother Douglas Mendez. They were at the polling station objecting to persons who went to vote on the basis that they were overseas for more than 5 years. Well, how would they know that? If you knew it on election day, you must have known it before with sufficient time to object to them rather than waiting until the election to try to take the objection point. And you know what the judge said, their consultant? Consistently with the decision of the Court of Appeal that followed shortly afterwards from the Mark Brantley case from Nevis, once a person's name is on the voters list, he has the right to vote. And the only way he can be prevented from voting is if his name was removed from the voters list in accordance with the provisions of the objections and in the provisions with the law. And the final point I want to make to clarify the confusion that Mr. Richards seems to think I have. In sections 41 of the Constitution, my dear consultants and Prime Minister and others, it says, subject to the provisions of this Constitution, Parliament may make laws for the peace, order, and good government of Dominica. All right, that sounds good so far. And then you have 47, 48, and the other restrictions on the right to vote, and section 50 of the Constitution said, I don't think I need to explain this to the consultant, but for the listeners, it's not an act of Parliament, but a document you put to Parliament for it to be discussed and voted on for the purposes of making it into law. So having the force of law relating to the registration of electors for the purpose of electing representatives or to the election of representatives and senators shall be referred to the Electoral Commission and to the Chief Elections Officer such time as shall give them sufficient opportunity to make comments thereon before the bill is introduced in the House, or as the case may be, the regulation or the instrument is made. So it's clear to me, with the little confusion that I have, is that the obligation to make laws for the elections vested in the Parliament, and the only obligation the government has is to consult the Chief Elections Officer and the Electoral Commission before taking the bill to the Parliament to become law, to be assented to by the President, and to be published in the Gazette. So the suggestion that an ID card in legislation recommended by Sir Dennis would be unconstitutional is a little difficult for this confused fellow to understand. I think that's all I wish to say at this time, and perhaps for the rest of the night.
Thank you, Senior Counsel. Is there anybody online who would want to make any comments on any aspect of Sir Dennis's report, or in the room? Sorry. Yes. Please state your name so that the transcriber can take your name down, please.
Colleen Felix Grant. I came here being of the view that the requirement for a limit on voting people overseas, it should be removed completely. However, I was still minded. When I walked in, I told myself I must keep an open mind. However, having heard Council Douglas speak so proudly of his opportunity, despite having lived in Dominica for almost 40 years, the opportunity to cast his absentee ballots through the mail, I am now even more convicted that this requirement for a 5-year or 10-year limit should be completely removed. If we are looking to modernize the process, if we are looking to give all Dominicans the opportunity to speak to the governance of their country, I think that should be totally removed. On the voter ID card, whether it is a national ID card or a voter ID card, I think it has been suggested that if you do not have a voter ID, if you are not registered and you don't have a voter ID card, then you, well, on the day of elections, you would not be allowed to vote, Council Richards, without that voter ID card. Afterwards. No.
Sorry.
No. Are we suggesting that when we present an ID, whether it is a passport or your social security card, to register to vote or to confirm, are we suggesting that thereafter we cannot present that very same ID to vote? Is that what we are suggesting?
That is what the draft legislation would provide.
I think this is something that we should consider very deeply. And it doesn't make sense that that very idea presented, saying this, I am that person, and it is accepted, it is thereafter on polling day, you have lost your ID, and you are being told, no, I won't accept your passport, that's not you. So these are the two areas of concern and suggestions that I have.
Thank you. Sorry? You wanted to say? Can we have the mic over here, please? To the President of the Bar. Mrs. Knight Didier.
Yeah, on the issue of the voter ID card and its importance, I think to say it as simply as well, you present your passport or your social security on the day that you register, and then that is sufficient thereafter to go to a polling station and vote. Okay. But once you register, there are other things that happen, right? You register to vote, you're also given a voter ID number. You are allocated to a constituency, a particular constituency, even a polling district, right? Those things are not on your social security card, they're not on your passport. When you go to vote, right, you present the voter ID, which has your face or your fingerprint, whatever it may be, to show you are you, yes, but to also show that you are you with voter ID card, with voter registration number 12345 of this constituency to vote at this polling station. Those other things are added as well. Okay, and this is why it is important, as I suggested, that the voter ID card have those features on it as well. Because it prevents then someone from going to one constituency. I am Noelis Knight Didier, I am voting here, and my name also appears somewhere else, or Noelis Knight appears, let me use a less unique name. I am Jane Doe voting here, and I go to another place, there is a Jane Doe voting, I'm registered there as well. I cannot vote in both of these places because my voter ID card will recognize me as Jane Doe with this face, with this voter ID number assigned to this constituency at this polling station. So it is not as simple to me as just an ID. You know, it is a voter ID.
So let me ask you this. We travel to different countries and we have to present ID. We have to present a passport. And the passport identifies us as Noelis Didier or Francine Barron. So a foreign country would accept that passport as certifying that the person before them is Noelis Didier.
For traveling purposes, yes.
Right. So why would they, if you have a list, if you're on a list at a polling station and you present yourself to vote, and you may have lost your voter ID card, why would they not accept your passport that is accepted by countries all over the world to identify you as being that person?
Well, let's look at the legislation. Doesn't the proposed legislation make provision for if you have lost your card or cannot present your card on the day? I think it does.
It requires you to make a declaration.
Exactly, a declaration, right. And so on and so forth.
But the argument that's being made here is that it should be any identification. It should not necessarily be a voter ID. I'm just going on the basis of what was just said, that you should be able to present, because the idea...
It's for the very same reasons I just said. I don't know what else.
The idea behind presenting an ID card is to verify that the person who presents themselves for voting is actually the person.
I'm not hearing you. There's so much chatter. I'll have to do like the parliamentary representative. And what was the preschool song again?
No. But
go ahead.
So my point I was making is that the whole reason for having voter ID is to ensure that the person who's presenting themselves to vote is actually the person that they say they are. Right?
That they say they are,
right.
Registered to vote in this constituency with this ID. It is more than just you are the face and you are the person.
No,
and you have the face and the name. It's more than that.
Purpose for the
are you saying, Madam Chairperson, that it's not more than just a face and a name?
I am saying to you.
I'm asking you.
What I'm saying to you is that what the whole purpose behind the ID card is to make sure that the person who presents themselves for voting is actually the person that they say they are. So if you have a passport which identifies you as being Noelis Knight Didier, and your name is on the list as Noelis Knight Didier,
but the name is not sufficient, Madam Chairperson, which is the point I'm just trying to say. Your name alone is not sufficient because there are other identification criteria once you register to vote.
And there are other criteria as well.
And further, most importantly, based on the survey done by Sir Dennis Byron, this was desired and wanted by the majority of Dominicans. Desired and wanted by the majority of Dominicans. I think that is the most important thing as well.
Well, the 800 and something people.
800 and something
out of 70,000.
It's very telling.
So I don't know how 800 and something people become the most telling. Dominicans. But anyway, I'm not arguing with you in relation to this. All I'm saying to you is that there are different views being expressed.
For sure.
The view is being expressed that if I can present my passport for getting on the list in the first place, why should I not be able to present my passport at the polling booth to identify me as a person?
And I think the answer to that is because after you register, other things are done.
Right,
but you are given a number and so on and so forth.
There are other provisions
which allow
as well
if you don't have your card, of course.
That's, yes. Any other comments? Sorry? Sorry. Mr. Richards and then somebody at the front here? Okay.
Madam Chair, I speak
Yes.
tonight for myself and every other lawyer who is not present. Madam Chair, regarding the broadcasting of political speeches and events.
Access to the media?
Yes, access to the media, sorry. Thanks for the assistance. I believe there should be a complaint mechanism added to the provision so that if an individual or party is deprived of that access, they can complain to the commission, who can then investigate with a view to enforcement. And I believe it would assist the commission in performing its duty. Because if the commission has to monitor, it needs additional staff, it needs additional finance, it needs an additional other resources. But if that complaint mechanism is there, then it also technically imposes a duty on the person who is being deprived, of that access to make a complaint that will be recorded and it can be followed up. I believe it is one of the salutary things we can do in relation to that particular provision. One other short point. I believe in relation to the ID card, we are missing quite a bit, because we tend to see Dominican as persons born in Dominica who have just gone abroad to live. Every economic citizen has the same right as every Dominican. And the liberalization that I'm hearing here in relation to voting, if that is permitted, it means 10,000 economic citizens can come in today, stay here for 3 months or 50 days.
15 months.
3 months.
15 months. Sorry, 3 months.
3 months, I said.
And yes.
And get registered, then return and never come back. But they will be entitled to vote. So we have to be conscious to look beyond ourselves. Everybody who cheats dilutes the value of somebody else's vote. And this is very important. While we want liberalization, we must also insist on protection of that value of the vote. And I believe the requirement for the ID card carries with it this specific aspect that is not on any other document: your voter ID number. It is not on your passport, it's not on your social security card, it's not on your driver's license. That is why if you lose your card, then for you to vote, you must, there's an alternative provided. You have to make a declaration, swear to it, as Mrs. Naidili was saying. You would have to commit yourself to saying that if you're found to have lied in that declaration, you can be prosecuted. Your ID number, it must be on the ballot to show that you have voted. And I believe we are missing this point.
No, I'm not. No, I'm not. And just to say to you that citizenship is not the only requirement for, or the only qualification for voting. You cannot be a citizen of Dominica and still be able to vote in Dominica. So using the example of 10,000 economic citizens coming to Dominica to vote, first of all, that's highly unlikely. Secondly, you don't even have to be a citizen of Dominica to vote in Dominica, and we must remember that point. So thank you very much. Can I please give the floor to, sorry? Miss. Who's going to come here for 3 months just to vote for 5? Anyway, sorry. Please, Ms. Nesty.
Yes, thank you. Helpful discussions, and I would just like to point that within the legislation itself, there is a qualifying factor for your registered address that places the onus on the commission so that we can clean that area as well. So the ID in itself is not the ground factor to say, listen, this is where I am. There is the process for the Electoral Commission to say, we are going to clean the list based on where you are. And if you do not come forward and say, this is my registered address, you will so be moved based on the evidence that we have had. So the voter's ID cannot be used as a basis of this is where I am. Imagine the state having to issue new cards every time, because we would hope that these cards are impenetrable and strong every time you move somewhere. I would not like that on any citizen, the financial burdens of that process. And we must also not, I will save that comment. Okay, thank you.
All right, so I think we've exceeded our time, although we started a bit late. I think we've given back the time. I want to thank everyone for their helpful comments and for their full participation in this discussion and the consultations today. As I said before, we have the opportunity, if you think of things that you wanted to say that you did not say, you can always send your written comments to the CAPSEC. And of course, if you have any additional issues that you would want to raise, please take the opportunity to send it to the CAPSEC. I just want to thank you all again for being here this evening, for participating. I thank the Prime Minister and members of Cabinet for being here, for listening to all of you of what your comments are so that they can take into account the things that you have said. And I thank the Attorney General as well for presenting an overview of the recommendations to us. I thank the media for carrying it, and for those who carried it live on the radio and on the internet, and those who have joined us via Zoom. Thank you all very much. And we hope that this process of consultation will continue, that people will be engaged, that people will share their views and make recommendations so that we can have a process that has broad representation of the views of all of society in Dominica. So thank you very much and have a good night. Please get home safely. Thank you. Sorry.
Well, we have just seen the conclusion of the first stakeholder consultation on the electoral reform report. We have heard from a number of lawyers, attorneys, who would have given their views on what they believe, and some persons were of the view that that certain things need to be changed, and some are of the view that they would not like certain things to be changed. And so the discussion here among the lawyers that were here was very much very much formal and educational.
Oui, Monsieur Joseph, nous voyons que nous fini première consultation pour changement processus élection, première consultation à pour là, qui Monsieur Dennis Byron Ba avait nous tan parole horde président pour board avocat Dominique, Madame Noelis Knight Didier, nous tan parole horde en nom aussi qui était là, Monsieur Richards. Parler aussi nous tan parole horde 4 pour moun avec identification pour moun qui a vote en Dominique, avec plusieurs moun représentés ici. Nous ka wè qui c'est avocat là, gardez pour là. et puis yo fait recommandation à ce qui s'acte là. Nous t'en parole M. Tony Astefan aussi qui était qu'à parler à ces lignes. C'est vraiment en bonne discussion là au soir. Et ben c'est vraiment en place là. Oui, opinion c'est bien faite. Oui, opinion c'est bien mené. Au soir, mon cas dit après-midi, mais c'est au soir. So oui, ça c'est première consultation. Ainsi, oui, pour la pour rangement pour cette sélection. Plusieurs avocats, nous pas tous parler, mais nous avons des gens qui ont représenté parler avec mon quoi qui c'est principe tout le
Well,
monde qui
actually,
a
she said that she gave her personal view
Yes.
and not necessarily that of the views the of the association, because the association has not met, so that they could have had discussion and could make an open statement.
Yeah.
And so she was able to give her personal view as to what she thinks of what the electoral reform report has given. And we heard from a few other members of the association, or a few lawyers, because you heard the president herself said that not everybody who is a lawyer is a member of the association.
That is true. So yes, it was definitely a fruitful consultation. For the first, it sets the pace for the others. We heard several points of views, but all for the benefit of one reason.
But tomorrow night, it's very interesting. DBS again will be live, both social media and that of our radio. And that we will be tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. Again, we'll be discussing with the political parties, all of the political parties, to include that of the persons who went out to be an independent candidate.
Right.
So tomorrow night we'll be very, very interested to hear what the political parties would have to say.
Yes, so content demain, consultation qui continue, avec parler puis parti politique, tout parti politique en Dominique, avec tout le monde qui monte pour élection générale qui passait, ça c'est vraiment quelque chose, vous savez. Moi les temps c'est possible ça là. Puis il y a toujours commandé quand on rangement pour cette élection, nous sommes en parlement, nous sommes pas dans une élection, nous allons continuer tous les jours, toutefois nous allons continuer. Moi les temps c'est possible là, c'est différents possibles là. Eh ben si nous avons un principe à ce rangement pour cette élection. Même M. Joseph, quand nous dit nous la première consultation à ce report la hot Sir Dennis Byron à ce rangement pour cette élection à Dominique, aujourd'hui yo joine en place conférence State House là avec avocats, avec différents monde qui a travaillé loi, avec demain yo que continuer ça encore et puis parti politique Dominique avec yo que ni d'autres encore c'est 4 tous les semaines Jictan li 28. Mais aujourd'hui, à tes première consultation avec avocat si rangement pour cette élection et puis oui pour la for Sir Dennis Byron.
And as we come to the end, I just want to say thank you very much, Jamasha Melo, for helping us in the Creole aspect of the broadcast.
Toujours un plaisir. Monter ça, mener, vous avez information about pep Creole là, vous avez le débat en anglais qui fait plus difficile, plus compliqué. Vous savez mener en créole, plus monde qui comprendre. It's vraiment un plaisir pour mener information.
And it's good that we can also help the folks, the elderly folks, who may not be speaking fluent language, or who would have heard things as we normally see from the Queen's language.
Right.
And here it is that we were able
Words
to
of grandeur.
help them to understand the Creole aspect of it, and so I'm sure that they're very much elated and happy that we are able to do that. And maybe people in the French territories of Guadeloupe and Martinique themselves who would be tuned in and could have a clearer understanding, because right now we're talking about modernizing our electoral process, and we want to see where we're going to go forward to this process, and we're hoping that Dominica will be, as we heard someone said there tonight, might just be a guinea pig in the process of trying to get this thing the way that we want it to be, Yes. But I'm sure as a people that we will be satisfied at the end, because it is said that normally that democracy deals with the majority, and majority is sometimes, as we normally say in Parliament, is 2/3. And so we are here live from the State House Conference Center, bringing it to you, the first stakeholders consultation of the electoral reform report of so.
Oui, on te ka di même quoi ça c'est vous avez un bon initiative pour Dominique comme on dit les nous te commencé. C'est un pays démocratique et puis c'est vraiment une bonne initiative pour jouer et puis tout le monde qui est affecté par ça et ben c'était vraiment une bonne manière pour commencer. Monde qui a parlé contre loi et différents quoi on dit legislations guide.
Reminds me this reminds me Jamasha, in that same building, well, not the structure of this building, but in that same location, that when they were discussing the issue of OECS unity in the 80s, David Charles then was Prime Minister of Dominica, talking on the issues of not just free movement, but talking about one currency, all of this necessary discussion. Young people from the NYC themselves was participating in that process. And I know one guy from St. Kitts, he's now Minister of Education, Curtis King, and also this guy from Dominica, the uncle of the parliamentary representative of Roseau South, Shakira Lockhart Hippolyte, that is Mr. Colin Baptist, also was a representative for the young people, talking on the issues of the unity of the we in the Windward Islands at the time it was called.
En place bien historique, en place ça, yo ka discuter en l'eau. Comme on dit, c'était vraiment une bonne discussion. Nous ka wè ki tout le monde ka quitté. Ça ka mené nous au bout. Programme nous pour aujourd'hui, demain encore à 7h, encore à 7h encore en place conférence State House là. Pour l'autre consultation avec parti politique.
So we'll be back tomorrow night at 7 o'clock to bring it again to the listeners. And so I would just like to say to my technical team, Dennis Nichols and Aaron Wilshire, and just want to say also thank you for the Creole aspect of it. And really and truly thank you to the listeners for listening to us tonight, and those who viewing tonight, to bring across to them the kind of information that is required by all.
Right. Non, moi c'est Jamasha Melo et puis monter là au compte monsieur Cecil Joseph. Actuellement, nous avons studio Ted Daily, studio Yona Radio DBS. Bonsoir.